and then we listened to like, Thick as a Brick. And like when you're 7 years old and you're going, why am I have to listen to this very, 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 very long song?
The definitive blues mandate, Freddie King. Good evening and welcome to Tone Check, the segment where we dissect the sonic gods of rock and roll. Tonight, the spotlight is glaring on Joe, the blues titan famously clad in a custom-tailored suit, a man whose guitar collection has its own zip code, a man who essentially is the modern blues rock economy. For years, has offered up fragments of his influences, casual mentions in interviews that often sound more like auction bids for vintage gear than genuine praise. However, sources close to the camp, affectionately known as where his gear is housed, indicate a recent, highly private event where the blues master was forced, perhaps by the existential weight of his own extensive record collection, to name his definitive top 10. The list, we can exclusively reveal, is not merely a roll call of legends. It's a blues mandate, a surprisingly modern, controversial, and deeply personal set of standards. To kick off this seismic revelation, the first name is the one who defined true aggression, Freddie King. Refers to him not as a musician, but as a scorpion, a player who would tear your face off with treble and play with bad intentions. King's brilliance, according to Joe, was his ability to be both a blues purist and a chart-topping pop star, a difficult feat in any genre, let alone one that constantly attracts musical police officers who insist on checking your emotional ID before you're allowed to play a minor chord. The joke here, of course, is that claims every modern blues lick is essentially a footnote to what Freddie King invented on a cheap tube amp 60 years ago. It's almost a giggle-worthy indictment of every guitarist currently using a wah pedal. Its reverence for King's untamed sound and commercial savvy immediately set the tone for the entire list, a balance of raw purity and undeniable success. We are told the revelation occurred over a cup of coffee so vintage, it had its own backstory and just couldn't help himself. He sees Freddie King as the progenitor, the genuine article who established the ground rules before they became the stuff of legend, which, let's be honest, is exactly the kind of deep dive, slightly pretentious analysis is famous for. You know, the kind of analysis where you need a thesaurus just to understand the adjectives. This man doesn't just admire, he the riff. The true North Star, Jeff Beck. Moving quickly to the pinnacle of technical and stylistic evolution, names Jeff Beck as his true North Star. Beck, who sadly passed recently, represents the impossible ideal for a player who not only revolutionized the electric guitar, but more importantly, never stagnated. According to the real genius of Beck was his constant reinvention, consistently getting better with every decade. He's the anti-vintage guy for the biggest vintage collector in the world. Often credits Beck with having weaponized the guitar, creating tones and techniques that turn the blues into something truly angry and mean. This is high praise coming from a man who meticulously curates his tone with amplifiers that require their own security detail. The slightly cynical joke here is that the master of the structured blues solo holds up a guitarist whose style was so fluid and unpredictable, it transcription, as if Joe secretly envies the chaos he refuses to indulge in himself. One source joked that his personal mantra is, "What would Jeff Beck do?" and then do the exact opposite just to be safe. Beck's inclusion confirms that for the ultimate form of musical purity is not preservation, but unrelenting, non-stop invention. He admires Beck's refusal to be tethered to a signature sound, which is, ironically, the exact opposite of what has done with his signature blues sound. But hey, heroes are allowed to be aspirational, even if they have to buy 200 vintage guitars to find their way back to a single tone. Beck remains the ultimate, untouchable virtuoso in cosmology, the one whose brilliance is so evident, even Joe's inner critic takes a much-needed coffee break. The British conduit and the purist controversy. Next on the list is a figure that causes endless debate among purists. What makes this inclusion so revealing, however, is not the name itself, but the context. Admits openly that was his gateway drug, the conduit through which he first understood the American blues masters. He famously learned the blues by playing along to the legendary John and the Beano album. For the self-appointed guardian of the blues, this is a fascinating admission. His roots are in the interpretation, not the source. The joke here revolves around the blues police. By admitting his British bias, is essentially confessing a minor, almost charming, misdemeanor to the blues authorities. It's like admitting you prefer the American version of The Office. It's technically blasphemy, but everyone does it. Inclusion is therefore less about his later work and more about his crucial role as the translator, bringing the deep, murky Delta sounds to the suburbs of New York, where a young could absorb them. This choice is a way of acknowledging that cultural lineage is messy and often mediated. Our source joked that Joe only admits to the Beano album and conveniently skips over his early foray into elevator music. But we're a news organization, we only deal in verifiable blues-approved facts. Represents the critical bridge, without which may have been just another teenager playing hair metal, a truly horrifying alternate reality that the music world avoided by the narrowest of margins. The respect is palpable, even if the origin story is a little gasp British. The original king and His Majesty B.B. King. No blues list is complete without royalty, and while Freddie King provided the aggression, B.B. King is named as the original king, the one who elevated the genre to high art with a single, perfectly bent note. Praises B.B. not just as a guitarist, but as a master vocalist and entertainer. He calls him the Frank of the blues, a comparison that elegantly captures B.B.'s smooth, sophisticated delivery and universal appeal. The crucial point is the economy of B.B.'s playing. The legendary guitarist could convey more emotion in one note than most shredders can manage in a dizzying cascade of 16. The running gag here is that, despite his own considerable soloing skills, constantly strives for that B.B. King restraint, a goal often humorously undercut by the sheer length of his own live improvisations. A source who wished to remain anonymous to avoid being buried under a pile of tweed amplifiers quipped that actually uses a tiny, personalized metronome that flashes the words, "What would B.B. do?" every time he hits a 12-bar turnaround, just to remind him to slow down and breathe. B.B. King embodies the soulful delivery, the deep sense of space, and the sheer authority that strives for. This isn't just a nod, it's a required membership fee to the blues club. His influence is not up for debate, making this one of the least controversial inclusions, which is perhaps why it's cushioned between the far more debatable British and rock legends. B.B. is the steady foundation upon which the entire list rests, a mandatory inclusion that respects for his pure mastery of the six-string narrative. The impossible standard, Albert King. Completing the trifecta of blues royalty is Albert King, whom labels the impossible standard. Albert King's playing was unique, a left-handed player using an upside-down right-handed guitar, leading to string bends that were utterly distinct and almost impossible for right-handed players to emulate. Whose own tone is often described as meticulously refined, singles out Albert for his raw aggression and emotional depth. He sees Albert as the immaculate conception of guitar playing. There was truly nobody before him who sounded remotely similar. The specific praise revolves around the tension in King's playing. The notes were huge, bent almost impossibly high, but always felt like they were on the verge of snapping, much like the tension in a great mystery novel. This section's joke is a dry one, aimed at gear nerds, likely spent hours, possibly days, trying to recreate Albert's tone through his vast collection of vintage Fender and Axes, only to realize the secret lay in the sheer physics of playing an instrument backward and upside down. He probably sent his guitar tech on a futile, year-long quest for an upside-down left-handed tone pedal. The moral of the story, according to our source, is that some tones can't be bought with cash or a vintage. They must be bought with awkward finger placement and sheer will. Albert King is a nod to the unique, the idiosyncratic, and the brilliant, confirming that originality often comes from breaking the rules of instrument convention. The modern outlier and the pop problem, Gary Clark. Returning to the contemporary, throws a curveball with Gary Clark, labeling him the modern outlier. In structured world of vintage correctness, Clark represents a delightful, albeit sometimes criticized, chaos. Clark is known for incorporating modern effects, a more punk-funk aesthetic, and a blues sound that's decidedly not encased in amber. This choice is incredibly telling because it shows can appreciate the evolution of the genre, even if it uses a distortion pedal made after 1970. He sees Clark as the genuine article, maintaining the soul of the blues despite the modern trappings. The joke here is a thinly veiled shot at the blues police contingent of his own, only allows Clark on the list to demonstrate he hasn't completely calcified into a musical relic. He's essentially saying, see, I listen to new music, but only this one guy, and he still mostly sounds like he learned it from the 60s. The real respect is in Clark's ability to remain popular and commercially viable without sacrificing the core emotional honesty of the music. It's an implicit challenge to his detractors. You can't call him a purist when he's openly championing a guy whose music might, on occasion, be mistaken for something on the radio. Selection of Clark is a necessary counterbalance to his deep-seated vintage obsession, proving his ears are still open, even if his wallet is only open for 1959. The unflinching purist and the killer. For pure, untamed, glorious volume names the late Irish legend as the unflinching purist. In a world full of complex signal chains and digital modeling, was the player who simply plugged a battered, road-worn straight into an amplifier and played with unparalleled tenacity and intensity. Sees as the epitome of realness, raw, exciting, and emotional. He was the kind of player who needed no studio trickery or vintage preamps. His tone was simply his fingers and his commitment. The humorous aside here is a gentle poke at its own complex, meticulous, and incredibly expensive touring rig. Its rig was so simple, our source joked, that probably bought discarded cables for 5 figures just to study the molecular structure of the copper, hoping to unlock the secret of his tone. Its inclusion is a profound testament to the power of human connection over technology. Its subtle admission that sometimes the best gear in the world is simply the player's soul. He's the anti-tech figure on the list, a necessary counterpoint to the gear-obsessed industry that himself largely drives. Is proof that the raw, uncompromising energy is often superior to the most pristine, multi-thousand-dollar tone. The shocking flip-flop and the sloppy legend Jimmy Page. This is arguably the most surprising and high-retention inclusion. Jimmy Page has a well-documented history of critiquing Page, often suggesting his playing was sloppy compared to his contemporaries like Jeff Beck, and yet has now performed a stunning flip-flop, naming Page in his definitive 10. The shift in perspective, according to our source, is realizing that Page's true genius lies not in his technical execution, but in his role as a composer and arranger. Specifically points to Page's work on songs like The Rain Song, that anyone who calls him sloppy should try to execute the complex, nuanced arrangement with the same feel. The joke here is that after years of criticism, finally realized that Page was so influential, he had to be on the list, or the list itself would be invalidated. It's a humorous surrender to pop cultural reality. Our insider suggested that likely spent one lonely weekend trying to flawlessly tab out all of Led Zeppelin IV, and after failing miserably, conceded that the overall composition trumps any individual missed note. Page's inclusion is an admission that raw feeling, massive influence, and compositional brilliance can ultimately outweigh clinical perfection, a lesson clearly took to heart, even if he arrived at it decades late. It's a brave and controversial choice, but one that demonstrates a widening, if grudging, respect for a player who defined the genre inherited. The slide guitar renegade and the quiet genius. Next is a quiet giant of the American roots tradition, whom labels the slide guitar renegade, is famous for his work on film soundtracks and his deep dives into world music, bringing a soulful, almost meditative quality to the slide guitar. For playing is magnetic, a demonstration of how much emotion and story can be told with a single note or a perfectly executed slide. This choice stands out because he's not a mainstream rock icon. He is a specialist, a master craftsman, admires the way his playing is always in service of the song, while simultaneously asserting an undeniable level of genius. The jab in this section is at the sheer obscurity of his material for the average rock fan. A source joked that probably only listens to while waiting for his vintage amps to warm up, a period of quiet contemplation where only the most esoteric blues can be tolerated. It's an important choice though, confirming that values technique that is unique and unmistakable, even if it's not played to a stadium of adoring fans. represents the ultimate lesson in less is more, a philosophy that is always trying to embrace, particularly when he has to pack 40 guitars for a 2-week tour. The untold influence and the soul requirement. Finally, we arrive at the mandatory, yet deeply significant inclusion of whom labels the untold influence. While is not traditionally cited as a direct stylistic influence on vintage blues rock sound, he represents the pinnacle of what the electric guitar could be, for the respect for is tied to his profound, revolutionary vision, took the established blues vocabulary of the Kings and launched it into a completely new, psychedelic, and electric future. Sees not just as a player, but as a sorcerer, a player who could conjure sound and emotion from the instrument that seemed beyond human capability. The specific reason for this inclusion, asserts, is that playing was fundamentally pure soul. The flashy elements were merely a reflection of the deep blues tradition he. The joke here is that likely spends hours in his gear sanctuary trying to use his pristine vintage fuzz-face pedals exactly as did, only to find that the secret was not in the pedals' components, but in the sheer, explosive energy of the man himself. Our source said confessed that is the only guitarist he can listen to and still feel completely inadequate, which, coming from the self-assured, is the highest form of praise. Closes the list as the ultimate aspirational figure, the one who proved that the blues had no ceiling. The final verdict and the omissions. And there you have it, its newly revealed definitive top 10, a mix of the obvious, the aggressive, the idiosyncratic, and the astonishingly modern. The list is a comprehensive blueprint for the blues, validating his role as a musical historian while also showing a surprising humility. The most telling part, of course, is who he omitted. The entire 80s shred movement, most of the grunge era, and several notable blues contemporaries. The verdict is clear. For Joe, the measure of a guitarist is not speed or fame, but pure, untamed soul and a revolutionary approach to the instrument. We'll be back after the break to discuss whether or not his choice of the sloppy Jimmy Page was the most controversial move of his entire career.